Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about CSS Grid. I'm actually going to be working through some examples and get you up and going so that you can start using it today. It's a really powerful native way in CSS to, sometimes when you say CSS Grid, people think that it's some third-party library you're importing. Nope, it is a native way to do responsive web design in 2018, and I really think that you and all web developers in general should start looking into it to be one of the ways that you handle, mobile design and desktop design and just responsive web design as a whole. And that's what today's video is about. We're going to be breaking it down piece by piece and show you what I think are the important parts so that you can get up and go by the end of the video. Hey guys, just want to do a quick shout out to my JavaScript course. If you're interested in learning JavaScript or just bettering your understanding of things like higher order functions, ES6, stuff like that, and you want to get better with algorithms, I do a quick introduction to Git as well. You can check out my JavaScript 360 Part 1 course. There's a link in the description below where you can help me out. Get it for just $14.99. It's got 175 lectures going over pretty much every aspect of JavaScript and about 7.5 hours of content. So check it out if you're interested. Thanks, guys. CSS Grid is the latest version of essentially being able to have a column grid system in your code, and it's very dynamic, and it can do things that you're like, well, I already know Bootstrap column grid, and I'm just going to stick with that. Well, not only is this native, but it also provides additional functionality, and we'll showcase some of that later on. So you might be asking about support, so I just pulled this up real quick. You'll see here that CSS Grid is supported in all evergreen browsers. Evergreen browsers meaning that if you have essentially a browser in the last 2 years of Edge, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, those are the ones that are going to update automatically. And so it is supported by all major browsers, and the IE 11, most parts of it are, but really if you're supporting IE, I feel bad for you anyhow. But so let's go ahead and showcase how we might get started with a traditional grid using native CSS. All right, so how do we get started with CSS Grid? Well, typically you'll hear someone refer to a wrapper class or a container class, and what that basically is a div that's going to make up our grid. We can have as many different types of grids or as many grids on our page as we want. Right now we're going to start with one, our div wrapper. And in here, you'll see that we have display grid, which is going to say, hey, we are now going to use CSS Grid, and this is our container class, our wrapper class that we're applying to the div to say where. And then we have this grid template columns. Now, you don't have to use FR. One FR essentially means break up the remainder into the amount. So if we have 3 fractions, it's going to take up a third, and a third, right? So that's how many columns we're going to have. So now if we were to comment in these other divs, which you'll notice here that in our CSS, I didn't change, all I'm doing here is giving backgrounds to provide context. You can see that each one of these divs is being sized appropriately. Now, that's all we're doing right now is we're just seeing, and you'll notice when I hover over here that we get this little dotted line, maybe kind of hard to see on mobile, but what that's basically showing you is the grid. It's showing you what's going on in the grid. Now, there's a lot of different things that we can do with the grid, and one thing that makes it so powerful is media queries. So let's say we want to do a media query where we're like, look, we want something to stack at a certain spot. Media screen, and we want to say the min width is, I don't know, 450 pixels. And then in here, we're going to take that wrapper. And I guess we should, so technically, if we're doing mobile first development, which is what we should be doing, this would be our mobile code. And I'll put a little comment here. So this is our mobile code. Oops, this isn't JavaScript. So mobile. And then here would be our desktop. So we'll say something like 750 pixels. And so we'll say desktop. So in mobile view, we just want one fraction. And you'll notice now when we do this, it's going to stack them, right? So we've already been able to handle our grid. It's going to stack them because there's only one row. There's only one column, right? they always have to be on top if there's only one column. So let's say in our desktop we want to go ahead, and it's already got the display of grid, but we want to overwrite this value here of grid template columns. We want to say, look, on desktop, we want to go ahead and make it a, when we're larger than 750 pixels, treat it as 3 different columns until we get to that point, that breaking point that we've defined. And you can see, I'm pointing at the screen like you can see me, but you can see right around that 750 pixel point is where it transitions. So this is a very powerful way that you can do responsive design relatively easily and quickly. But I digress. Let's go ahead and talk about a little bit more detail about how we might manipulate the items of our grid. One other thing I wanted to say real quick before we move on is to use the repeat CSS function. This is one of the things I've been trying to get more comfortable with as I get better with CSS, is getting familiar with media queries, more in depth, CSS Grid, of course, and as well, and a lot of the methods that are in here. And I didn't really discuss what this is. So if you've never used media queries, this is a generic media query. It says if it's a screen, which is pretty much anything that's not a printer, or a there's one more, but basically anything, a monitor, a phone, whatever it is, a viewing device, and if the width is ever greater than 750 pixels, apply this values. But you know, let's say we had 10 items, right? Do we want to really do 1FR, 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 1FR? No. So a cleaner way, is we can specify how many times we want to repeat our unit of measurement, which is the 3FR. So that's just something I wanted to mention because it can get relatively out of hand quite quickly. All right, so you may be thinking like, all right, well, what if I want to add some padding or margin onto our div here, right? We've set it up to take up the full amount. That's what we wanted to do. So you might do something like this, margin dash, we'll just do margin, you know, I don't know, 25px all around it. And you'll notice that this is gonna kind of cause some issues here. Well, not cause some issues, but it may not be what it is you're looking to do. So you'll notice that we've applied a 25 pixel margin around our whole item here, which isn't really the correct way of doing it, and it's affecting the other items. And that's fine, but the CSS Grid way that we would do it is we can actually, so that we don't have to go and create a new class and apply it to every single one, we can go ahead and do something where we can apply a grid dash gap of, I don't know, 1 EM or something like that. And you'll notice now that now we have this nice gap that's in between all of our classes right here. So we're expecting this gap, and even if we were to go to mobile now, you'll notice that gap is there as well. Now, and it's all around it. So we have this gap that we've applied to all the elements in our application. Now you can do pixels, you can do whatever you want for our grid gap, but you don't have to do just a gap around all of it. We could go ahead and do something like, maybe we just want a grid dash column dash gap, and we would give that, you know, 10 pixels. We could do that as well. And so you'll notice that here for our columns, when we spread back out, we have a 10 pixel gap. And of course we could take this off and change this column to a row gap. And then when we come back into our row view here on mobile, you'll notice we now have that gap as well. Now you may not want your grid to take up the full area, like have the full area, but you don't want necessarily the div to expand. And let's go ahead and remove this grid row gap while we're at it. And you might say, you know what, I want all of my grid items to be sort of on the right side. I want it to be all the way to the right. And you could do that with align items like so. Or excuse me, justify items. So justify items will set all the items of the box. Now this is if you want to do it for all of the items. We can do it individually as well. We'll showcase that in just a second. But let's say we wanted to have it all to the right, and we save it. You'll now see that in our grid here, if we hover over, that the div content that is our grid item is going all the way to the right. That's what we're doing right now. And you know, we could do this to the left. we could do this to the center. Notice how also it's not taking up the entire thing. We have our entire room for it, and you'll notice that when it's centered, it's spaced evenly and nicely, right? But maybe we want to overwrite this, and we can with justify, so item justify. Which one is this? Justify dash I. Oh, justify self. So let's say we want justify self on. We'll make the left one left. And so now you'll see this one's left, but these two are inheriting, right? Just simple CSS. And we can do something, for example 3, where we want to justify self to the right as well. And now that one is to the right. All right, let's take a second and go ahead and add about to example 2. We'll add a height of about, I don't know, 250 px, something large. And while we're at it, we can we'll just leave that there. It doesn't really matter. Now let's say we wanted to actually vertically center things. We could do that, and we could do it on all of them using align items, and we could center it like so. And you'll see that these items are now being centered based off of that. Now, if they were all the same height, nothing would change. That's why we had to change this, right? So, you know, because if we took this out, right, they were all the same height and they're already centered by default. But when they're not all the same height, because the content might be dynamic, we're going to center this. And then, of course, if we wanted this to be centered as well, we could go ahead and drop off justify self, and it'd be perfectly centered within its grid container. And you could do, you know, more than just center. You can do, you know, line items. What is it? Is there an end? Left, I think, is one. Is it right? Align items. Well, there's center. I forget what all that are. But we can play around in our CSS grid here real quick. Like so. And we just type in align items. So there's a whole bunch. There's center, there's end, there's left, there's normal. And we can override it like we did before as well. So we have center here, and we want to align self, and we want to do this to the right, or let's do it to the left. Start, that's what it is. It's start. So here we go. So I'm getting my terminology mixed. So start is going to be to the top, while end will be to the bottom. And so now we have an easy way to position our values, either for the entire items in the grid or for the a single item as well. So we can do that vertically and horizontally. Now also, don't think that you have to have for CSS Grid to work. Right now we're basically taking up 100% of the screen. That's not a requirement for CSS Grid. So this can be nested within other things, but let's say we only have 50% or 60% of real estate to be working with. The CSS Grid will work just fine in that 60%, right? We're really defining the grid itself, and you know, we're manipulating it to work however it is that we need it to work. All right, what I want to do now is just add a few more items here in our example code. And this is going to be probably just, I think we only need one item for our example. We'll go ahead and make this example 4 and example 4, save it, and you'll see now when we added this example 4, by default, it is now added. In our grid, we have said, look, we're expecting 3 columns. So when we have another div or a block item, it is expecting it to be in the very next most available row, which is row 1, column 1 right here. And so if we did this again and we added example 5, you would expect it to be exactly right here. And you'll notice it's also inheriting the properties that we're working with here. So we make this example 5. And we make this example 5, bam, bam, everything's good. And then we could do example 6 as well. And everything's going to roll over. And if we happen to have another block item, it would create a new row to continue going on here. And you'll notice that it's currently, with the way our CSS is set up, it's spacing it out evenly for each one. Now, I talked earlier about why CSS Grid, other than it being native, but it actually adds additional functionality. Right now, you're probably saying, Dylan, man, I could have done all this in Bootstrap and not have to learn anything new, which would be a bad thing to say. But it's not completely true. I think this is a lot cleaner, for one, because we can manipulate things in the CSS without having to add additional items. So what I'm going to do now is, instead of applying grid template columns this way, what we're going to use is what's called the grid template areas, and it's going to allow us much more flexibility on how we manipulate our column grid system. All right, so let's change a little bit of our code right now. So far we've been just stating how many columns we want, and then our HTML here says, okay, well, this is the first block item, so we'll render that, then we'll render this and this in order. That makes sense, right? There's no big harm in that, but that's not always the case, right? When we go from desktop to mobile, sometimes we want things to be flipped, right? Maybe the menu's on the right side in desktop view, and it goes to all the way to the left on mobile. It gets a little bit complicated, and there is a way to go and set, column values and line values to make this expand. But I think the better way, in my personal opinion, is we can use the grid template columns instead. So instead of repeating like so, we can go ahead and do something like this: grid-template areas, excuse me. And it's going to look a little weird at first. Don't worry about it. And what we're going to do here is, essentially, in each one of these quotes, we are going to define a grid area. And we'll go ahead and define those grid areas first. So we'll just say, we'll call this EX1, EX2, EX3. And then on the next one, put a little comma here, we're going to go ahead and put EX4, EX5, EX6. Those are our grid areas. And what we're saying when we set it up this way is that in row 1, column 1 here, row 1, column 2 here, row 1, column 3 here, we are saying that we want 2 rows and 3 columns, and on top of that, we can now easily target these in our CSS classes. So we're going to copy this real quick, and let's go ahead and take this align self stuff out, just because I think we all understand what that's doing now. And we'll go ahead and we'll create some of these real quick, because we're going to need it for our 6 items. And we can go ahead and have the same background color, so I'm not worried about that at this point in time. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to define these grid areas. And this is going to be EX1. And on grid area 2, this is going to go ahead and be grid area EX2. We're essentially saying, hey, these are our grid areas that reference our wrapper class that is for the template areas. So EX1, EX2, we're going to do it one more time here. Grid area EX3, grid area EX4, grid-area EX5, and then we're going to go ahead and say grid-area ES6. Excellent. So, what did I break? Oh, ES6, EX6, and grid template. Oh, my mistake. So everything's set up right, except I forgot to change the name of the IDs here. So we're going to make that example 4, example 5, and example 6. It doesn't know what to do because they don't exist. So what we have here now is, and we might as well remove some of this stuff just to make it a little bit easier for us to read here, like so. Go ahead and save that. And what we have here is we have the ability to easily manipulate where our items go in the grid right now. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's say we wanted for some reason to move example 1 to an example 4. Well, on desktop view, right? On mobile view, we haven't touched anything. It's going to work the same as you would expect. It should have. Oh, my apologies, guys. I forgot to instantiate our grid template columns here. So we still need our grid template columns, but now we can manipulate those areas appropriately. That's why these were stretching so strangely. So let's say we wanted example 4 to be an example 2 spot in our desktop view. All we would have to do here is change this and change this, and now we have example 2 and example 4 has swapped, and we don't have to touch anything in our application. We don't have to change the HTML. It's a simple 1 or 2 line CSS change. Now another cool thing that we can do with here is, like, so far we've, instead of having to apply margin and padding on the sides, like we may not want it to take up the full width, and instead of using width, we can actually add sort of filler sections. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add this 1FR to make this 5 rows and columns. You're saying, Dylan, but we don't have 5 rows and items. Well, we can use the dot here in our CSS grid to add spacing on the end if we want to, or any other way. So let's see spacing first. So now you'll notice that when we hover over, we have our 5 columns. We're just kind of using it as, some spacing on it, but we could use it any other way we wanted as well. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. But let's say we wanted a gap there, and now we have this gap within our application, and it's really easy to do when we're using the grid template areas. All right, so let's go ahead and set up the grid template areas for our mobile response, which is going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to have the grid template areas, and we'll go ahead and remove that like so, and we can do that. So every row in this instance essentially is going to have its own insert, right? So like maybe we want some padding in that first row, and then we want to have EX1, and then we want it to have EX2, then we want to take a EX3, then we want it to be EX4, EX5, EX6, and then we want to do another padding like that. We could, if we wanted to, for our mobile view, and would do something like that. Did it not apply the spacing here? I actually thought it was going to. I've never tested this before, but to me that made perfect sense. I guess we wouldn't be able to do that vertically like that, or I may have set something up. But you can see here that we're now setting our grid template area up to handle that. And it doesn't have to be like that, right? So we could, let's say we wanted to have a menu that came in, we could go ahead and do something relatively simple like this. Where, like, look, we just want a space. We don't want it to be right, the full width right here. And we don't have to use fractions either. Maybe we just want a 50 pixel insert. And so you'll notice now that we're just indenting 50 pixels on our template areas. So far we've been assuming that we wanted to stretch an item the entire length, and we've talked about how we could set 50 pixels, but sometimes we might have at our fractions, that it's too dynamic, and what we want to set is like a minimum value and a maximum value, and we can do that with the min max. So min max is a CSS function where you can set a minimum value such as 50 pixels and a maximum, so actually let's make this 200 pixels, and a maximum value of, I don't know, we'll say 300 pixels. And so you'll see right now this is going to have a maximum value because it's a block level element. It's going to stretch out to 300 pixels. However, as we move over, and it's going to slowly go down and down, you'll notice that it's kind of hard to tell right here, but it's been getting pushed in, and that value has been going down to 200 pixels, and it's not going to get any smaller. You'll notice how the letters aren't wrapping over. That's what min-max is going to do for us. Now, there's also some other CSS functions that are worth mentioning because we are now dynamically rendering content, and so things get a little bit more complicated. Some of you may not even know functions were a thing in CSS. I didn't learn this until about 2 years ago. Another way that you can manipulate using CSS functions is with the fit content. So fit content will tell the CSS grid for this row to keep it within a certain amount. Like, that's what we need this to be. Fit our content, if you can, to the best of your ability, and let's say 200 pixels. That's what we want to allocate for this. And you'll notice you'll notice it's actually less because it can and it will go less. But we're saying, please don't make it any more than 200 pixels, right? That's the objective here, is try and get it below this amount. That's what fit content does. Fit that content in there, son. So let's go ahead and give some more examples here about how we might manipulate our grid areas. So I'm going to start by just removing these additional empty spaces in our desktop view here. And we got to remove those dots, right? Because now we're going to remove those empty areas. And what we'll have here is an evenly spaced out div. Now, let's say we want to instead have certain divs and certain, let's say we want EX1, for example, take up 2 spots. The only issue that we're going to have right now is that we're not hiding this additional one. But if we had, I don't know, let's just add some columns here. We'll add 1 additional column, and then we'll add, so whenever you can't have more columns than your template area, so you have to handle that. That's fine. We can do something like EX4, EX4, and then here we'll just make this, we'll make this a dot. We'll give it an empty area. Why is example 2? Oh, we're not calling example 2 anywhere. I was like, what happened to, why is example 2 off here in the abyss? So you'll see what we're doing now is we're going to go ahead and say, look, take our row column example 1 and actually have it take up 2 spots. That's what we're expecting out of it. We want it to take up 2 spots. Same thing with example 4. And we could do it this way as well. Let's say we wanted example 6 to take up 2 spots. We could do it like this. And so what we're doing is we're extending out the amount of rows and columns and sort of grid that these items are supposed to take up, that we're expecting them to take up as they should. So it's one of the more powerful items. Now, so far we've showcased how to do this to grid template areas, and we're doing it all in one section. This is why I wanted to show this method. However, we can do this using grid row end and grid row start and things like that in each individual value here, but I don't even want to show that because I don't think you should do it. The reason for it is you can already see that we have about 50 lines of CSS to manipulate. Let's say this was a header navigation, and this is pretty accurate, but the bulk of our logic, other than just assigning the grid areas to the div, is in a wrapper class. It's in 2 spots for how we're going to handle it in mobile and how we're going to handle it in desktop. And I think that's the way it should be done, and it's going to lead to faster development. So I don't want to even show those other items, but do be aware that they are a thing and that you can state where these boxes are going to start as well. So this is a very brief rundown of CSS Grid. I hope you guys found it helpful, and I hope you start integrating it into your workflow and learn more about it, right? This is about 75 to 90% of what you need to know, in my personal opinion, minus those few things that we talked about. I've been using CSS Grid for about the last 2 months, and I really do like it, and I'm really enjoying it, and I hope you guys check it out. But as always, don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, share, support me on Patreon, hit that notification bell. That's a thing. That's a real thing. That helps a lot, I guess. That's what I'm told. Check out the merch, the courses, all that sort of shit. I reworked that description down there, and it looks great. Give it a look. I'll see you next time, guys. Bye. So L. Wade here says, how many hours of an 8-hour workday do you actually spend coding versus in planning, meetings, project stage activities, customer support, or non-other coding activities? I would say this varies job to job, but if I had to give like an absolute answer, I would say about 6 to 5 hours a day you're actually going to be at your computer, sort of hacking away. 2 to 3 hours is going to be meetings. It's going to be not networking. It's going to be communication of like, hey, let me go see if I can unblock other people. But I would say expect somewhere between 50 and 75% of your time to be coding, and about a fourth to up to 50% at like the real worst companies. I say worst, but just over I hate meetings, man. I'll be the first one to say in our retro, let's eliminate meetings. So I would say it's probably 60 to 75% on average. It's probably closer. 50 is a little bit low. But again, it depends on what sort of company you're at and how they do things. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. If you like this series and you want to learn more on your own, might I recommend the book Clean Code. I have an affiliate link in the description as well as in the card that you can click and check it out. I highly recommend it. I'll be doing a book review about it shortly. Check it out. Bye guys, and see you next time.